what the Syrian people have been fighting for. But the Syrian population is divided. That's a reality as well. And it's going to be a very long struggle to re-engage with a political struggle to change that regime. And I don't think it's going to happen through this armed conflict. So the negotiations that go forward, I think, are very complicated. It involves US-Russian negotiations, global negotiations, US-Iranian negotiations, as well as the role of the other regional players. There are 7 separate wars being waged in Syria. They all overlap with who are the fighters, but the people dying are the Syrian people. These are 7 wars that are all being fought to the last Syrian. And only a couple of the wars are about Syria. There's the war between Syrian people and the regime. There's the war, the regional war for power, largely between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There's a sectarian war between Sunni and Shia. There's a war within the Syrian opposition between secular and religious forces. And among the religious forces, there's a new war between ISIS and the rest of them. So there's a series of wars being waged. And the notion that there can be a negotiated settlement is that there is always a negotiated settlement to wars. The question is how many more people have to die first. So that's why this notion that Rama said that's so important about the primacy of negotiations and taking it seriously and making that part of our demands so that we don't just say no bombing, but we say, yeah, no bombing, and the US needs to do X, Y, Z to get new negotiations underway, to get increases in the humanitarian aid that's available, because these pledges are not being followed through. It's going to be a huge challenge, and it means a real commitment of people in our movement as well as what we demand of our government.
So, you all have something to chew on? So I guess I'd just open it up to some questions for these two, and if we want to, we can kind of open up beyond that. Who's got questions? Anyone else? So let's take 1 and 2 and see what comes of it.
I was reading a speech by Martin Luther King about the Vietnam War when he spoke out against it. And one of the things he said, his understanding of Vietnam was that they had to deal with it for themselves. He talked about self-determination. And one thing that the United States has proven, in my opinion, is that we are not qualified in any way, shape, or manner to solve any of these things. The United Nations, I see, is the only culture for that. And shouldn't that be our message? That the United States is not a fair player in this at all. Whether it be Iran, Israel, whatever. We should just stay out of it. And also, I think we win over Americans who are kind of sick and tired of it. I get the sense, and I think especially after these elections, about meddling in other countries' affairs. And I know that's terrible for people in those regions, especially that it's caused when we invaded countries and such, and we should own up to that. But couldn't a simple message like that be that they need to work it out for themselves? We're just messing things up. We're just making things worse.
Do you want to should I take 2? Okay. Do you have your question?
Yeah, I guess in a way I can follow up on what he's saying. I think that we're in a very tricky position. I mean, we have to remember, we don't want to be saying we bombed. I mean, this is a government that is not really our government. I mean, it's representing corporate interests. And we need to really make that distinction. And I think we need to drive it home in many ways as an anti-war movement. And I think that I'm not sure that I really agree with Phyllis that people are largely motivated here to look the other way because they buy into the fact that, we're sitting on the hill. I think that there's real fear of coming out with positions that are strongly pro-Arab or that really strongly protest anything that's happening to Arabs because of the fear of being labeled anti-Semitic, because of the fear of being labeled pro-terrorist. And I don't think that the anti-war movement has done enough to holistically look at the U.S.'s role in the Middle East. We're not addressing the full-scale panoply of Israel's role as a kind of handmaiden to imperialism. I mean, for instance, it's not enough to say that we have to deal with the influence of the Zionist lobby to make sure that there's not blockage of our going in and negotiating with Iran over the nuclear question, when in fact the driving force for the nuclear arms race in the Middle East is the fact that Israel has one of the most huge arsenals in the world, hasn't signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Its range of its missiles go into Europe and into major Russian cities. On and on. It supplies surveillance to the United States. I mean, the problems with Israel go well beyond the occupation, and until we holistically address those issues as a way of looking at the totality of corporate policy there and bringing it home to people here, that the things that I think are driving the reactions in the elections is that they're scared to death of not having an economy that is viable. And the reason they don't is because all of our resources are going into these wars. But until we stop a kind of piecemeal approach, we're going to go nowhere. We didn't have a piecemeal approach in Vietnam.
So can I just check in with the room? It seems like we kind of got one direct question, a little bit more sharing her thoughts on the panel. Do folks want to have questions directly for these two, or do you want to make it more conversation among here? Folks who want more just straight questions for these folks? People who want to have more conversation among everyone else?
How about both?
Well, it'll be a little bit of both. I think, so maybe let's stick for the next 20 minutes or so to direct questions with these folks, and then maybe we can wrap it up and have those who want to really go deeper into this and go back and forth can kind of start talking to each other. That sound good? So who has other questions? Let's go, and then maybe I'll just take one more and then let you answer.
I guess I have a clarifying question, and I'm sorry if I'm being dense here, but I'm not. If either of you or both of you could clarify a little bit more for me what exactly the U.S. interest is in bombing Syria, because given, Phyllis, you said that the U.S. can wage, it's an empire, it can wage war wherever it wants, and it does. Given that, it's a pretty, with all due respect and of course compassion and for the people who are dying, it's a pretty half-hearted effort that the U.S. is waging. So if you could just clarify that for me, I'd appreciate it.
So we've got a question about isolationism, more stuff about where the anti-war movement is, and then a question about what really the interests are in Syria. I'll just let you two go ahead. Answer any of those?
Yeah. So in an ideal world, the U.S. would not be doing anything horrific in the world, and we can kind of say, yeah, or just take a vacation. But we can't ignore the U.S. is a major reason why the region is the way it is now. And I think, and it's difficult, again, I think we have to take this anger that we have around Syria and the U.S. bombing of Syria and what's happening in Syria. In the end of the day, I honestly, and you heard the very complicated kind of negotiations that Phyllis was talking about happening. To me, there's very little U.S. leverage, honestly. That's I think my difficulty when people ask, well, what should the U.S. do? I'm like, I honestly don't know what the U.S. can do. Yes, there's very complicated things it can do. There's not, but there's very little direct leverage the United States has about what the Syrian regime does. But the United States has a lot of direct leverage in other things, and I'm someone who does not believe U.S. policy is separate in Syria, separate from Iraq, separate from Palestine, separate from Egypt and Bahrain. I think they look at it as one wide region and they act like that. And so there's a lot we can definitely do to deal with the regimes, with the U.S. support for the regimes, whether it be Egypt, which has gone. I think for the past, if you've been following the uprisings the past 4 years, I think Egypt is kind of the most depressing, even though it's not been where the most people have been killed. It's just, there was a very big high, and then a low, and then even lower, and now I don't know where we are. You know, like, we're at a point where things are worse than they were under Mubarak, which is saying a lot. We're talking Bahrain. I mean, we talked a lot about Syria not getting much attention. I mean, Bahrain was a revolution. The Saudi army just went down and kind of crushed it, and that was the end. And people are still struggling every single day. A lot of political prisoners, but no one, does anyone talk about Bahrain? No one, not even amongst, again, people who are aware of what's happening. Bahrain's like, not at all. And then, of course, the biggest problem, the U.S. support for Israel. You know, we saw what happened over the summer in Gaza, 500 dead children, and our U.S. Politicians think, yeah, it's okay. The U.S., they have a right to defend themselves. The story about General Dempsey coming up and say, yeah, I'm actually sending U.S. military folks to learn from Israel how to limit civilian casualties is just disgusting. And so these are things that we have a direct impact on. And I personally believe will have a greater impact, because I don't think, for example, I don't think the rest of the region will be free as long as Palestine is not free. And I don't think Palestine is going to be freed until the rest of the region is free. So it's like this thing that feeds into one another. And so whatever we can do, where the U.S. has direct leverage, is eventually going to trickle down to the rest of the region where we may not have direct leverage. In humanitarian aid, we still have a lot we can do. I think, again, we need to deal with that. The issue, you were talking about people being afraid to speak up, whether they're going to be accused of anti-Semitism or, you know, pro-terrorism. Islamophobia is definitely a problem in this country. And it affects all sectors. I mean, even if we have to be critical of ourselves in progressive circles, leftist circles, I mean, there is Islamophobia amongst ourselves as well that we need to deal with. I think if you just look at the numbers of people who came out against the U.S. bombing ISIS versus the numbers that came out against the U.S. bombing of the regime, there's a difference in the numbers. And I think part of it has to do with, well, you know, those are terrorists, so let them be bombed, you know, and that's something we need to deal with. And so I think it is important that anti-war activists look at Islamophobia and the impact of Islamophobia, and the fact that, you know, Phyllis mentioned Rasmia's case in the beginning, and how many Muslim Americans and Arab Americans and Palestinian Americans have been, as part of this war on terror, swept into prisons and sent to jail for no other reason. They might say the same exact stuff as a white anti-war activist, but just because they happen to be Muslim, Arab, or Palestinian, they're the ones that are being thrown in prison. So that's a reality that we need to deal with. And I mean, Obama, I think, has had a very confused policy on Syria. And it's just, you know, from one thing to another. Yeah, all of a sudden there's news, yeah, the CIA is training, you know, it's like, oh, they're training 100 people. And then, yes, the U.S. is sending in lots of weapons. Okay, here's a couple. The U.S. they invited the last FSA, there's a new FSA chief that was just a couple months ago came to power. It was appointed. But Salim Idris, who had been the previous one, was supposed to come to the United States and meet with the administration, and then wasn't given a visa, and then told you're not coming. So this very confused kind of like, we started March 2011 when the revolution first started. Hillary Clinton was very clear. We believe Bashar al-Assad is a reformer. Very clear. A couple months later, we're back. You know, the regime's gonna fall any minute now. No, wait, we need to think about negotiations. The chemical weapons attack, red line cross, we need to attack. Then all of a sudden, no, they just, as long as they get rid of their chemical weapons, now everything's fine. It's been very confused. And I think that's part of the problem, because why a lot of the groups on the ground fighting get very angry. Like, you keep promising us things that you don't come through with. So you need to let it, like, if you're not going to come support it, that's fine. But we need to also be planning how we move on with this. Now it's very clear, I mean, I think a very clear message has been sent. When you decide to finally intervene, and you're intervening, and again, I'm anti-U.S. military intervention. I don't want this to seem like, no, I think the U.S. should have intervened against the regime. But when you do intervene, make the decision to intervene, and you intervene against ISIS, and are not hitting any targets that are not ISIS, or the other targets that you do hit that are not ISIS, or other groups that are fighting the regime, that I think is sending a pretty clear sign of where the United States' interests are at this moment. The regime stay in power, continue this kind of war. It's not a good long-term strategy. I think, again, refugees are streaming everywhere. You're causing chaos in the rest of the region. But it seems like the U.S. is okay with that at this point because either they don't know what else they want, or maybe they prefer the chaos. Who knows? For a while, the U.S. used to prefer stable dictatorial governments. Now it seems like, whatever, chaos seems good too. So yeah, I mean, it's not very clear, but I honestly don't think there is clarity.
I never want to undermine the importance of incompetence in U.S. policy. It's as important as the commitment to imperialism. So the notion of, the uncertainty of their policy is certainly a consistent reality. I think on the question of the role of the UN that you raised, guy in the back raised early on, I think it's absolutely right, and it's one of the things that I and others have been saying and writing, for years, that all negotiations, whether it's on Palestine, whether it's on the region-wide crisis, on anything, need to be led by the United Nations and not by the United States. That's not going to happen anytime soon. It doesn't seem to me that calling for what amounts to an isolationist position, saying, essentially U.S. hands off, I don't think that gets us anywhere, and I don't actually think it's a good policy. We want a different engagement. We owe a huge debt to the peoples of Iraq, the people of Afghanistan, the people of Palestine, the people of Syria, peoples whose lives we have destroyed as a country and as a government. And I don't usually say we either when we're talking about this, but I do in this context because I think we have allowed it over many generations to go forward. We owe a great deal. We don't owe continued occupation. But I think saying we should just get out and leave them with what we have destroyed and what we leave behind is not either a moral, it's certainly not, it's not what you said, it's what he said. It's not either a moral or a politically viable option. On the question of the fear of criticism, I think that Rama is absolutely right in terms of Islamophobia in the broader society, within our movement, across the board. I also think it's true that there's been extraordinary shifts in the discourse in this country so that it is no longer dangerous for those who are not themselves Arabs and Muslims to criticize Israel. I'm out on the road all the time criticizing Israel, and I don't get death threats anymore. I used to get them all the time. I don't get death threats anymore. I don't get called an anti-Semite anymore. I don't get called a self-hating Jew anymore. I mean, once in a while I do. But and then you just get over it. But it doesn't happen anywhere near the way it used to because the discourse has changed. The work of organizations like the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, which started out with 6 organizations very nervous in 2001 and now has over 400 member organizations, has been a huge part of changing the discourse. The rise of organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace has been huge in transforming how people come to understand the role of Israel in the region, etc. I think that when we look, when I wrote a couple of articles on, 4 things the U.S. can do that are not war in Syria, 6 things the U.S. can do to help end the Syrian war without going to war. And the last one was always longer term. We need to deal with things like creating a weapons of mass destruction free zone throughout the Middle East with no exceptions. So it starts with Israel's nuclear arsenal. All of those things in the long term are going to be critically important if we have any hope of any kind of stability in the region. But I do think that there is a horrific set of wars going on with people dying in horrifying numbers. And the question of what to do fast to stop the killing, stop the dying. There's no easy answer to that. The old Chinese proverb that says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. That applies to diplomacy too. The best time to start U.S. decent diplomacy is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Now we're dealing with diplomacy that has been completely militarized. We have lost the capacity for serious diplomacy that once existed 60, 80 years ago. And the question of what's it going to take to reclaim that, diplomacy is what we need rather than war. saying we need nothing rather than war doesn't, to me, really work. We need diplomacy and negotiations rather than war, as well as massive amounts of money. And just finally, I think there is something we can pull into the current discussion from the period of the war in Iraq. Many of you will remember during the war, one of the popular slogans from Colin Powell was this pottery barn analogy. You know, why we have to stay in Iraq. It's like pottery barn, he said. We broke it, we have to fix it, right? And I always thought that's the wrong analogy. The right analogy is not pottery barn. It's the bull in the china shop. What do you do when the bull gets loose in the china shop and breaks half the cups? You don't keep the bull in the china shop and ask the bull politely to fix the broken cups. You get the bull the hell out of the china shop and write a check for the damage. That's what the US needs to do militarily. Write a check for the damage, get the military out, and begin this process of serious engagement with negotiations. Now, I think that has to start with a call for ceasefires locally and nationally in Syria as well as in Iraq, and a move towards an arms embargo. That's not going to look, if it happened, the immediate aspect of that isn't going to be fair in the sense of it's not going to be evenly felt on both sides. It's not a fair war. But it will have the potential to stop the fighting, because if the arms flows continue to go in on both sides, there's no reason in the world why anybody is going to follow any agreement for a ceasefire. So the two need to go together. And I think that combination is what we need to work towards.
Okay, maybe I'll take one more round of questions. Well, why don't you start on in the back?
Oh, okay. So, thank you all. You know, there are a lot of really concrete demands. You know, you asked what should we do. I mean, clearly stopping the bombing and clearly humanitarian aid. But it seems to me it begs the question of what is the power of our movement? You know, we just had an election, and 2/3 of the American people did not vote, because the vote was none of the above, right? And I feel that the peoples of the world are also in many ways saying that. So I really think we're at a very dangerous moment where, you know, the survival of humanity and the planet is really at stake. And the question of how are we going to build an independent political force as a movement that can contend for power, because the Democrats and the Republicans who have governed this country for as long as, you know, there's been one, are really not our friends. I don't think they're the friends of the Syrian people, the Iraqi people, certainly the Palestinian people. So I just want us to begin to think about not just what we want to demand, but how we're going to build the power from the bottom up. And I think it's both an electoral power as well as a street power. And that it's just really time, you know. So I just kind of want to open that up as something for us to begin to think about as serious movement people who are also very serious about, you know, how do you do this immediate peace, right? And I think that is probably, I'm not sure about the United Nations, I'm not sure about the check writing of, you know, the U.S. government, because they're also engaging in a very murderous policy against our own people, right? I mean, we're waiting for Ferguson to just go up in flames, you know, because of similar things. So just a kind of a bigger question about how we do the things that we know need to be done politically as a movement, to think about that.
So,
And any thoughts you all have?
that'll only take about a minute and a half. Any other maybe more direct questions right for them?
I have one question. Are you actually Syrian? Are you from Syria?
Yes.
Okay, so you know all about this stuff, right?
I know.
More or less. I was wondering. That's my question. So you are from Syria?
I'd like to say what was just said, but in slightly different words. And I'm building on this incredible story that I'm hearing on Veterans Day, framed in an anti-war spirit when the rest of the country is glorifying war. And the irony is really overwhelming. I thought there were just a few wars going on simultaneously. Phyllis has identified 7 just in Syria. It makes me feel that citizen diplomacy is more likely to work than the official state diplomacies. Her one positive experience one of the things she mentioned was the interaction between Code Pink and John Kerry in a Senate hearing. I think we need more citizen diplomacy efforts like Code Pink is doing in other countries.
But anyway.
But my point is that I'm feeling that there are so many reasons why focusing on a particular symptom of the larger crisis is not going to solve the larger crisis. I'm hearing